there for you. Want to go back to NBC 10's Rosemary Connors, who is standing by with our legal analyst Enrique Latoison. Rosemary.
Erin, before we get to Enrique, we do want to point out, we just learned from our other colleague who is inside the courtroom, Deanna Durante, and I'll get your commentary on this, that Bill Cosby, the judge, has decided he will have to pay for both of these trials for the cost that for the prosecution, which we know is in the hundreds of thousands of dollars, and on top of that, a $25,000 fine. Your reaction?
I think it'll be closer to $1 million by the time you factor in all the security, everything they had to do to prepare for these trials. I mean, each and every day you have so many people working security and working overtime and all the staff and everything it took to put not just one trial but two trials on. And you remember the first trial, the jury was out quite a long time. And each day the jury was out on that first trial, security and everything had to be done in order to accommodate this trial.
And in terms of the judge's reasoning in this case, you were there in court as the judge gave his sentencing to Bill Cosby. Describe what he said and the reaction in court.
I think the judge was very eloquent in stating all his reasons for why he gave this sentence. Early on, he immediately told everyone, I'm not giving home confinement, which is house arrest. I'm not giving him county sentence. I'm not giving him intermediate punishment, which is a type of weekends and house arrest and things of that nature. He must have said within 5 minutes into his reasoning that this is a state sentence and this is a sentence that is warranted by the facts of this case. And then what the judge did is he went little by little, slowly going through all of his reasoning, explaining why he came to the result that he did. Some words that he constantly used over and over again was to say that he has to have a sentence that is to protect the public. He said that many times. He said the gravity of the offense, he needs to take that into account. He also said the impact of the victim and the victim's family also had to be taken into account. And then the fact that the rehabilitative needs of Mr. Cosby. And what was interesting, he often said that there are no rehabilitative needs of Mr. Cosby based on the pre-sentence investigation. So what he was focusing on was those other three factors. And he spent a lot of time talking about the impact of the victim's family, the victim's input statement, the statements that they wrote, talking about the voices being heard. You know, he really went very, very detailed into explaining to Mr. Cosby so he was aware of what things were important in him making the sentence.
It's interesting to think about it during the trial. You're hearing the facts. This is when you find out the facts. This sentencing phase has been full of emotion, and this is when we're hearing that emotion from Andrea Constand, from her mother who spoke, other family members, and now in fact from the judge.
The judge said something which was right on point. He said, Mr. Cosby, you claimed her silence was consent. Those words are very powerful. You claimed that her silence was consent. He said she was silent. She was silent because you drugged her, you gave her an intoxicant, and because of that, she wasn't able to consent. But you took her silence as consent. And he went on to say, further on in his reasoning, is that, you know, Ms. Constand said in her impact, she's no longer silent.
Right.
And that the other victims in this case are no longer silent. And he made it clear to Mr. Cosby that, you know, based on your actions and the things that you did, that you hear these victims and you hear what I'm saying, the judge, to you, and that you and what you did, your actions are very serious. He constantly said that the weight of the sentencing is important to show the seriousness of the sexual nature of the crime in this matter.
And I believe, as we have other cameras trained on the courthouse, that there are people exiting the courthouse right now and exiting from that courtroom. Obviously, the many reporters who are in there, and then of course Andrea Constand and the others who've been listening to the judge's remarks yesterday and today, now knowing that Bill Cosby will spend at least a minimum of 3 years in prison, in a state prison, maximum of 10 years.
That's correct.
And in terms of some of the judge's other comments in speaking directly to Mr. Cosby, you brought it up. He said, you are in so many words, you are a danger to the public. And that seems to fit with the fact that earlier this morning, the judge determined that he is a sexually violent predator. And that's significant. And I think it's significant, and you can speak to this, Enrique, as well, that it's not so, obviously that means he's going to have to be a lifelong registrant with Megan's Law. He's going to have to comply with monthly counseling. of course, is when he's out of prison, and of course, quarterly reporting to authorities. For the average criminal in this situation, that's a real problem. You apply for jobs, you apply for housing, leasing, that's difficult. For Mr. Cosby, he's a man of means. When he gets out of prison, that's more of an annoyance. But let's talk about the fall from grace. This is somebody who was America's dad, a hometown hero in the Philadelphia area, board of trustees at Temple University, and now he is labeled as a sexually violent predator.
Not only that, but with that designation, the police have an obligation to tell the public where he is. The judge painfully went over earlier today, before the break, when he labeled him that. They talked about what's required of him even when he travels. He has to check in if he goes to a concert or a show, or he goes to another state. He is obligated to check in with that state police and let them know, hey, I'm Mr. Cosby and I'm here and I'm a sexually violent predator.
And this, of course, is when he gets out of prison, after he serves his time. The minimum 3 years, meaning that he could be up for parole in 3 years based on good behavior.
Correct. Based on good behavior, based on what he does while he's in there for those 3 years. He's going to be required to take sexual prevention classes, those types of classes that deal with sexual offenders. He's going to be required to do those classes. Now, if Mr. Cosby participates in those classes and he does what he needs to do, he could position himself in a way to possibly get out at earliest at 3 years. But, you know, the parole board wants to see that someone is rehabilitated, see they take responsibility for their actions before you come before the parole board. There's no guarantee you get out at 36 months at 3 years. It's going to be up to him to prove to the parole board that he is a candidate and someone that should be released. And it'll be very interesting to see whether or not he eventually takes responsibility or participates in those classes and things that he's going to have to do in order to put himself up for parole.
We're just finding out from our eyes and ears in the courtroom who are still there that the judge is taking a 20-minute recess right now, and we'll return to determine more about the bail issue in this case. So we'll have to see what the judge does from there, where we go from here and what comes next. In terms of Mr. Cosby and the impact on this community, Enrique, you've been a lawyer in the Philadelphia area, Penn and Temple grad, Penn undergrad, Temple law grad, so you know this area very well. Describe what it means to the people here.
Well, I mean, as a minority, you know, watching Mr. Huxtable on television when I was little and thinking, you know, this is who, you know, we all aspire to have a family like Mr. Huxtable. I came from a single-parent household, and watching that household on television, you think that's America's dad. You know, he's a doctor, and everyone in there just looks like they're having such a good life and having the perfect family. And now you think to yourself that this was a person that was committing sexual crimes underneath the law. He's been found guilty. The jury has spoken. It was a unanimous verdict, and they said that Mr. Cosby, America's dad, was committing these crimes.
Dr. Huxtable, the person who always took the moral high ground.
That is correct.
Legal analyst Enrique Latoison, thanks for your input. We'll get back to you in just a moment, but I want to send it back to my colleague Erin in the studio.
Rosemary, Enrique, thank you for that. If you're just joining us at home, Bill Cosby has just been sentenced to 3 courthouse, inside the courthouse, and of course, right there on our NBC 10's Rosemary Connors and our legal analyst Enrique Latoison. Rosemary, very quickly, we just got another update from Deanna Durante, who's inside the courtroom, saying that Bill Cosby was actually talking with a friend and smiling, remaining at the defense table while we wait another few minutes before this bail hearing resumes.
And we know, Erin, that this hearing will continue at 2:40 this afternoon. It's interesting to hear Erin just telling us that Mr. Cosby, reports from inside the courtroom, is that he was sitting and talking to a friend and smiling as this recess has just begun. Earlier today, when he came into court, walked up the ramp, he was smiling as well, in good spirits.
Throughout the process, it seems today, from seeing him in the courtroom, he was very upbeat. You wouldn't have thought that someone was facing a sentencing. He was polite. He was respectful. He didn't seem to be upset or stressed. I think Mr. Cosby might already have kind of been resigned to his fate of knowing that he was most likely going to jail, and this was going to be the day.
Or realizing what happened right after his conviction in April, when there was a discussion about what to do related to his bail, and the district attorney had brought up, well, he might be a flight risk, he might have a private plane or have access to one, and Mr. Cosby had an outburst in court and used an expletive directed toward the district attorney. That was back at his conviction in April. Just yesterday, his defense attorney apologizing for that.
That's correct. I mean, they've had some time since the verdict coming down and until the sentencing today to counsel Mr. Cosby, to explain to him his behavior and what's going to be expected of him in the courtroom.
His defense attorneys,
His defense attorneys. And, you know, you have to be respectful throughout this process. The judge is going to be the one to lay down his sentence. The last thing you want to do is bring added attention to yourself by being disrespectful or acting out in court. And I think that he followed his counsel's advice and, you know, today was very respectful. At some point today, he was actually being questioned by a prosecutor asking him about his rights and different things involving the sexual predator designation and things that were going to be expected of him. And they were going back and forth. Mr. Cosby was answering questions and the prosecutor was asking him questions. And you would have thought he was talking to his own counsel. That's how polite he was.
In terms of the sentencing, let's get into that just a little bit. You know, you are one of our legal analysts here. So, okay, we know that the max that the prosecution had asked for yesterday was 5 to 10 years. We had been saying first thing on Monday that he could spend the rest of his life in prison, potentially 30 years in prison. And here we are one day later, we're talking a max of 10 years. And in fact, that's where we are. So walk us through that.
Okay, so he had 3 different crimes that he was found guilty of. Each crime had a 5 to 10 on each one. Now,
add them up, you get 30.
Add them up, you get 30. Now, the judge actually said today in the sentencing, he said the jury doesn't understand merger. And merger is the legal word for saying that even though he got found guilty of 3 different crimes, and they're 5 to 10, 5 to 10, 5 to 10, 2 of them merged down into 1, and that the maximum that he could get based on it being 1 act was only 5 to 10. Now, that's why the prosecution asked for 5 to 10. It's not like they wanted to give Mr. Cosby a break and ask for 5 to 10 instead of, 15 to 30 years.
Right.
But they asked for 5 to 10 because both parties agreed, along with the judge, that 2 of the crimes merged into 1. Now, once you got down to that means that the maximum he could get was 5 to 10 years. Now, the judge talked a lot about the ranges from the legislature and the ranges of sentencing and what is deemed to be appropriate and consistent. That's when you get to your standard range of a bottom of 22 months to a top of 36 months. So what the judge did was he sentenced him in the standard range, which is basically the middle that the legislature says is appropriate, but the top middle, okay? Now, if he'd have given him the aggravated range, he would have given him 4 years. If he'd have given him the maximum of time, he would have given him 5 years.
We should point out, though, the judge has quite a bit of latitude, and those state sentencing guidelines are just that, guidelines, recommendations, and not something that's mandated.
It's not a mandatory minimum. The judge could have given him well below that, or he could have given him well above that and given him the 5 to 10, or the aggravated range, which is 4 years. But what the judge basically gave him the top of the standard range by basically saying, we cannot treat Mr. Cosby any different based on who he is, his wealth, his fame, and everything he has, his reputation, that he has to be treated fairly. And we believe, the judge said he believes that this is fair. He's within the sentencing guidelines, he's within the standard range, but he's at the top of the standard range.
Nearly 3 years in terms of this legal process, start to finish, December 2015, December 31st, 2015, right before that statute of limitations could have run up on Andrea Constand's claim of being sexually assaulted. Here we are, September 2018, nearly 3 years ago, nearly 3 years later.
It's interesting you say that, Rosemary. The judge said 34 months. 34 months. 34 months, Mr. Cosby. That's how long this has been going on. So you just said it, close to 3 years, 34 months. That's what he told Mr. Cosby. This process has been going on, and how long Ms. Constand's been victimized by this process by basically saying this went on for 34 months. Interestingly, he gives him 36 months. So I think that, his words were typed out. The judge was not reading off the cuff. He was reading from typed out, prepared words. And I think that there's something to be said for the fact that he mentioned the 34 months of what you put the victim through and then gave him 36 months.
We had 2 trials to think about it. I'm going to send it back to my colleague, Aaron Coleman, live in the studio. Aaron?
Rosemary, we're also getting some more color from inside the courtroom. We're being told that Bill Cosby... Right now at 5, a stunning fall for one of America's most beloved television dads and comedians. Bill Cosby now a prisoner after he was sentenced to 3 to 10 years for sexual assault, marking an end to a years-long legal battle. NBC 10's Rosemary Connors is live at the Montgomery County Courthouse.
Rosemary, you're going to give us some insight from our legal analyst there.
Yeah, Enrique Latoison, thanks so much for being with us, Enrique. So we want to talk about the appeal process. Really quickly, walk us through the procedure over the next week and the next month.
Well, the first thing they got to do is they got to put in a formal reconsideration. What that is, you're asking the judge to reconsider your 3 to 10 year sentence. You're asking him to give it another shot, to reconsider it and give me a lesser sentence. You also then have a formal appeal that you can do to Superior Court. That's got to be done within 30 days. It has to be done in writing. And even if Mr. Cosby couldn't afford an attorney, which we know he can, the court actually would appoint an attorney for him for his appeal process.
And we do expect that to happen, as his defense team has said since his conviction, we plan to appeal. In terms of what that appeal will look like, we have something of a good idea of what the defense may be arguing, what they say their reasoning is for an appeal in this case.
Well, when you do an appeal, you actually throw everything at the wall. So
and
they
see
will
what sticks.
Right, you see what sticks. You know, what they'll do is they'll try to say that the judge was biased. They'll try to say the judge should have recused himself. I think those things are not very likely. They'll probably try to say that the sentence was unduly harsh. I think that also is going to not really be a good strategy, since he was sentenced in the standard range. Now, with their big points that they will say is, listen, same judge, same defendant, same prosecution. The first trial you allowed Ms. Constant, you allowed one prior bad act witness. Second time around, same judge, same defendant, same prosecution. Now you allow Ms. Constant and 5 new witnesses. And they're going to say that that was abusive and that unduly weighed out, fairly prejudiced the defense, and by doing that they set up Mr. Cosby to fail. And
right, and what happened? What's the difference between the two cases? Well, in the first trial you had a hung jury. You did not have a verdict. So is that what influenced his decision to allow more evidence in the second time? On top of allowing more women to come forward and testify, he also allowed the deposition in the civil case to come out.
You would think that it was a different judge. You would think it was a different defendant. I mean, the amount of evidence that came in on the second time around was a huge amount of evidence that he said on the first time around was not allowed to come in, and he found that evidence to be prejudicial. So you know that the defense is going to capitalize on that. Whatever words that he used not to allow it the first time, they're going to use that against him in the appeal moving forward.
So, of course, that may be the crux of this case, trying to spell out the differences between the two trials.
There's 2 different trials, 2 different types of evidence that came in.
Enrique Latoison, of course, our legal analyst who's been here since the beginning. We appreciate it.
Rosemary, thank you so much. Our coverage of today's sentencing continues at 5:30. We're live with reaction from Philadelphia. That is where Bill Cosby has close ties to the community. And again, that's coming up at 5:30.